Welcome to this episode of Next Exit, where we speak to industry leaders and CFOs on how to operate their business to maximize their next exit. Today, we're speaking to Joseph Sanborn from EverQuote. Joseph, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Dan, for having me. Appreciate it.
So to kick it off, Joseph, can you tell us about what you do and tell us more about EverQuote, please?
Sure, Dan. So EverQuote, we're an online insurance marketplace. We went public in the summer of 2018. So we're an MIT-founded startup that uses tech and data to acquire consumers online. We like to say that we've been doing AI long before AI was in fashion. I joined the company in the fall of 2019, about a year after we went public, and it's obviously been a really exciting journey for us as a company. Our mission in life is helping carriers and agents in the property and casualty insurance space, which is for the average person, home and auto insurance, and sort of other personal lines, find consumers online in the digital world to help them sort of grow their business. So the theme for us is, in sort of the backdrop, is an industry shifting from offline to online, and insurance is much further behind other industries. You compare it to broader financial services, insurance is probably, at least in the US context, probably at least one third less consumers online today relative to those other industries. And our whole thesis has been how to use data and tech to help those carriers agents grow the business successfully, find consumers online in the digital age. And as you think about this next period of growth around, AI and how that is changing it, for us, we're really excited by that because that's really our heritage being applied to a new phase of our growth.
That's awesome. And can you give an introduction to yourself, please, and how you got into the space, into your role as CFO?
Sure. So as I said, I joined EverQuote a little after the company went public in the fall of 19. And it's about 15 months into the journey being public. So although I wasn't here as part of the IPO team, I really sort of felt the early days of the company being a young public company. So it's been a little over 6.5 years at this point. It's been a really fun journey. I've gotten a chance to wear lots of different hats internally. I joke when I left banking, I'd be worried about getting bored when I went inside a company. That certainly hasn't happened at EverQuote. I started our corp dev practice, did some work in investor relations, had a really interesting role from the outset of my time. I worked really closely with our founder and CEO. He was a third-time founder, first-time public company CEO, and a lot of my prior life been working with founders, and I really enjoyed it. I remember meeting Seth Birnbaum, who was our founder and CEO, and really sort of connected with him and had a great time working with him. And so that was a bit of my early time here. And I guess prior to here, to give you some context on my journey, is my background had been almost 25 years in investment banking, mostly in M&A and technology banking. So very broad, from working with founders to large public companies. I first started my career was in big firms. I started at JP Morgan. Then I shipped to the second half of my career was at more boutique firms, which I really enjoyed. And I think part of the big firms gave me the experience of how to sort of work in complex environments, and small firms probably gave me a bit of that entrepreneurial experience, which was really helpful when you work in a small public company and wear a lot of hats. You just have to figure out how to get stuff done and adapt and not necessarily have all the right process. So I think those experiences really were formative for me. And my journey here has been, is that wearing a lot of different hats, but I did IR, investor relations, corporate development strategy. I did a lot of things around strategic finance, building out those. So it's been really, I think, a really great background. I was fortunate to have that experience before stepping into the CFO role. I worked closely with the board, and then I took over various responsibilities as we evolved as a company. I eventually became chief strategy officer, and I became CFO in the spring of 2023. And since that time, I've just sort of continued to evolve in different ways in the company and take on more responsibilities in addition to being CFO. When I took over and stepped into the CFO seat, or sat down in the CFO seat, I should say, it was a really challenging time for our business. It was a period where we're in the middle of an industry downturn, and the insurance industry is the one we serve, and we really help carriers and agents grow the business, and that's our purpose for being. Coming out of COVID, they still did not have rate adequacy. And so meaning our business was to exist to help them grow the business, and they didn't want to grow their business. So it was a really tough time for us as a company. And if I look back, there was a silver lining. When you think about these really down periods, I always try to, maybe I'm a glasses half full kind of guy, but I try to think about what did it do for us? And I think it really forced us to think back, say, what is the thing we do really well? How we help carriers and agents succeed long-term? And importantly, how do we build shareholder value in the long term? A lot of our work going into the summer of 23, we made a lot of significant changes as part of me becoming a CFO of the company. And those changes really are working. Like we're executing well, we're driving value for our carriers and agents, our customers. We're better aligned with creating value for our shareholders. And I think really the key from a CFO perspective is how do we reset, when we reset the organization, how do we think about building value for each of our key stakeholders? And I know it sounds pretty simple, but a lot of times you sort of lose sight of it. You get in the moment of doing the things you have to do, and you sort of forget that. And what are the things as a business that really are differentiated for us? Like, perhaps we weren't focusing those enough, and we need to say, what is going to help our customers and agents be more successful? And if we do that well, the differentiated, that'll be great for our shareholders. And that came back to a lot of our roots, which is how do we use data and tech to help acquire consumers online, help people grow their business successfully. And so that's been a really exciting part. I guess the other thing I'd probably touch on when I think about it is we did a lot of time orienting the company to how do we build value. And again, this also sounds simple, but I look back at the time, I kind of laugh a bit. Coming out of the changes in 23, we were a startup company based in Cambridge. Although we went public, we had this very entrepreneurial zeal. We were young, energetic, brilliant folks across the company, and we went time and when Wall Street, and I should take some of the blame of this since I was part of Wall Street then. Wall Street really cared about growth, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about profitability. So we were not a West Coast and a company, as I like to joke. We weren't lighting money on fire. We were an East Coast guys. We still had some Yankee sensibilities, but we were not sort of clear rooted on how do you balance growth and profitability, and seeing that is key. And I think that really started to change for us. So we started to build a real compass for employees, which is how for employees to understand how are we building value, how are we helping build shareholder value. And so we kicked off a lot of efforts to help employees really focus on those issues. And, things like EBITDA was not a word that was ever talked about at EverQuote before I was CFO, outside of the executive ranks and the board. And I kind of laugh about it now and I smile a bit about it. But I was here as what I really didn't think about. My time was really focused outwardly, focusing on investors and corporate development activities in the board. And I just sort of, assumed everyone thought about EBITDA like I did. And it's kind of funny. I think partly the COVID experience, we weren't together as well. But all of that made us say, when we came out of this, we made the strategic realignment in the summer of 23 when we did ours. We really helped people say, hey, what is this EBITDA? And importantly, what is cash flow? How does EBITDA translate to cash flow? Because that's not always the case. We had a model at times where we were building EBITDA and it wasn't always translating to cash flow. And so we really got folks thinking about that. And I think that was a really powerful thing to do. And we tried to help explain to folks that the world was different. A lot of times for employees, it's easy to lose sight of the world around you. Say, geez, we went public and we're supposed to grow and this profitability wasn't really in vogue. And yeah, we were crazy spending money, so it was all great. And the world of Wall Street had changed. And really what's come around, which I would say is an enduring model, which is how do you balance growth and profitability? That, in good times and bad times, that's a good combination. Really high growth can come in and out of favor. And I'm not opposed to really high growth, but when you do balancing growth and profitability over time, that is an enduring model for building value. And we tried to educate folks in that. I think that's been really important. How do you think about the trade-offs between something, hey, it may drive top line growth, but if it's not going to drive shareholder return, the bottom line, does it make sense? Sounds simple when you're sitting in a finance class or think about it with a finance team. It's a lot different when you're actually trying to, as a company, you're excited about new ideas. Okay, wait a second, is that really going to drive the impact we want? And so that I think has been a big part of the change. The employees now are saying that. I think that is a really big difference. We've educated folks, and I think that's the real power of it is, we've helped the organization see that. I remember, just an example that I think back to is early on when we sort of rolled out this new strategy, my CEO and I had a session with our product team. They were in for an offsite and we were doing a discussion about it. And one of the questions we got on the journey is they said, are we really going to, do this thing about balancing growth and profitability? And our CEO and I, who are very close, said, yeah, we're really going to do this. And Chris said, okay, I guess, they weren't so thrilled. And I jumped in and I said, I think this is going to be really fun, guys, because when you think about it, it's actually a harder problem to solve, right? Anyone can grow at a certain point. Anyone can just make money and not grow. But if you can do both, that's a much more complicated problem to solve. And we got people excited by that more complicated problem. And we're very fortunate. We have brilliant employees, extremely thoughtful folks. And we gave them a new challenge and they've risen to that challenge. But framing profitability and growth, I had never thought about framing it that way till I was CFO, and how to excite people about that idea. To me, it seems pretty natural. Growth and profitability sounds pretty exciting. But when you explain it as how it builds value for shareholders, and we're all shareholders, that's important. The other piece I would say is it also helps oriented towards it's a complex problem, and so smart people love to have challenges, and this sort of reframe it that way as well. So both those have been really powerful, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's a phenomenal ride. I think something that jumps out beyond the actual performance is that talking about this, you're focusing on how do we help customers, how do we drive shareholder value, and how do we drive a culture. And a lot of times with the CFO, it's how do we sort out the finances of the company, and how do we right the ship, how do we sort out the balance sheet, whatever it might be. Can you tell us how your role has changed as being in strategy and moving over to CFO while maintaining that mindset?
I think part of the reason I think about those pieces at the end of the day, I say there's from a time investment bank, which is a lot about M&A. We think about the numbers and the negotiating process, and all those things about deals. But when you step back and think about it a bit, it probably took me a while to sort of get to this realization. I was actually, what is really the process of M&A, and how does that compare to what I do as a CFO? And so the realization came to me when I was out actually with one of my friends last summer, just sort of catching up, and he's saying, "Hey, really surprised you really like being a CFO, given you were really into the sort of the thrill of the deal when you were a banker, and sort of really loved that. And sort of, I never thought I'd see you go in-house." And it made me start thinking about what is the similarities in the roles and sort of the transition. I'd say for me, you spend a lot of time thinking about the numbers in both jobs to frame the issues, whether it's how much you should pay, the synergies, all those types of topics. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is really trying to make difficult decisions with incomplete information. And how do you communicate and influence people to make decisions with imperfect information? And whether it's an M&A deal when you have an 80% chance of this or that working out, or making a big investment decision in a company that's going to, maybe make a significant part of the bet of the strategy for next year, it's the same thing, right? Which is, how do you think about the numbers? How do you analyze them? But then more importantly, how do you take that information, distill it down to a way to making a decision, often a very difficult decision, which involves influencing some really key people. And that's sort of what I've sort of learned over time. The similarities are quite similar. Whether it's an M&A deal, big capital markets deal, frankly, making a big decision within a company, and that could be, making a big investment decision, but also be the compensation philosophy for the company. How should we think about that? How do we think about, how we communicate externally in some big decisions? And so, although it's different, in many ways, there's a lot of similarities, and I think that's something I probably didn't know going into it. And when you think about the issues, you often think that I start first with numbers, then you pretty quickly realize that numbers are just the beginning to start to help to think about it. The question is, how do you get people aligned around making big decisions? And that's the part I've really enjoyed a lot. And if I understood then about the transferability, it was so similar. Wish someone had told me that. Maybe I would have figured this out sooner. It was a lot easier.
On that note, you said before that you've achieved some really great results. So can you tell us more about what it's like as the CFO to step into that role in the time of challenge?
I like to say that, over the last 3 years, Wall Street has started to appreciate that we're executing well and we're focused on driving shareholder value. I might argue they're not giving us the rewards we yet deserve, but at least some of the investors, they appreciate it. They said, you're executing, you're saying what you're going to do, and you're actually going about doing it. And I think that's obviously critical as a public company. But when I think back to those early days, I'd say first and foremost, it was a blur. It was like a 90-day period, and I remember it was the summer of 2023, and it all sort of blurred together. Why? The company was in crisis mode. We're in the depths of an insurance industry downturn, which a macro event which we did not control. And no matter how much we did well in the company, it didn't matter to the overall performance because the macro headwinds were changing it. So in those first nights, I spent a lot of time thinking about the numbers, and reorganizing the business. We made a strategic decision to reduce our workforce by about 30%. We exited a business line. We sold off assets. We restructured our bank arrangements. I did my first public call as a CFO by about 90 days after stepping into the seat. And so it was all in a very condensed period of time. It was a lot to tackle. And I'd say it was a very quickly, like throughout it, though, I was always very focused, like, how are we going to drive value? And I know at the time going back, I feel pretty confident I was not articulating around the company what I was thinking. I was just in crisis. I was like, we're in the storm. You're at the helm. We got to get to port. And so you just take the wheel and you go on some type of instinct. But what drew behind me was always this vision, or at least in my head, was how are we going to build value? And at the end of the day, our business was a very good business in a very unusual time and a very difficult time. And I sort of felt that was also true, that there was light at the end of the tunnel and we were going to get there. And we had this once in a generation downturn that was influenced by how carriers came out of COVID. So very unusual shock to the system, something, and that, hopefully most CFOs you listen to this will not go into this situation, having a once in a generation downturn to deal with. But it was a time where, carriers, the context was carriers in the US set their pricing on all 50 states individually. And in all of those states, they did not have rate adequacy. So a little different than the UK model, but it makes it just much more complicated to get rate adequacy because you can't change rates overnight. You go through each of the 50 states separately, and it can take quite a long time. And typically, when you think about getting rate increases for carriers, it's a 6-month process, 6-9 months, you get rates in, and then you move on and you can move on. Given the inflationary environment we're in, we had this period where it took, better part of 2.5 years to go through it. And it's like, how did this ever happen coming out of COVID? And I think when you look back, and I would say the chief actuaries and the chief underwriters, they just didn't have a reference point. Like, they got the part that people would start driving again. When you think about what drives insurance carriers' claims costs, there's some key variables they think about. So miles driven, they figured out they would start driving again. They got that part right. What they missed were things where they had no prior experience in their models, because we haven't had a pandemic since the Spanish flu. So one of the things they missed, for example, was that supply chain was going to take 9 months to get parts through to the US. And as a result, people had all their cars would be in the shop for 9 months. They need rental cars because those would drive up those costs. They'd be waiting 9 months for parts, and those parts didn't come in. They also missed another dynamic, which is in claims costs. To think about when you total a car, it's based on used car pricing. No one would have envisioned that used car pricing was going to go up dramatically to the point it was even more expensive than a new car because no new cars are available. So those were all the things that made the system blow up. So you look at that, there was a path through it. It was not sort of this period that it wasn't sustainable. It clearly would the ship would come back to some normal center at the industry. It was a massive industry. We knew it was a big opportunity. Just a question how to ride that wave. And that certainly created some challenge for us. But the positive was created an opportunity for us to create some real operating leverage in the business as we refocus the business. And as we come out of that period, we've done well financially. We've gone from losing money to making money. We've had expanded EBITDA margins. For the past 2 years, we just completed our earnings call. For the past 2 years, we actually highlighted that our operating expenses have not changed for a 2-year period. Revenues more than doubled, operating expenses stayed the same. What drove that is not that we just kept the cost structure all the same composition. Under the covers, we're making lots of changes, a lot of it driven by AI, driving efficiencies in our operations. And then in turn, we could take those in our core operations, especially, driving automation. We could take those incremental dollars and reinvest them in new growth areas, whether it's additional AI capabilities, whether it's data science, whether it's new products for our customers. And all of that has been part of the journey for us. But it's exciting to think my first quarter as CFO, I looked back at this as I guided for, $4 to $6 million negative quarter EBITDA. I guided for this quarter, our midpoint was $25 million. So I feel like we made a decent journey, and we need to get recognized for it more, but it's exciting to see that we're making progress.
I guess to focus on that for our listeners, in times of crisis, there's often a lot of headcount change. A lot of people will be going into a time of crisis like you did. So in that first 90 days, you came in, cut costs, prepared the strategy, and had your first earnings call. What was going through your mind, and what did you say in that first earnings call, and how has that played out relative to the great success you've had over recent years?
In looking back on the period, my wife reminded me, she was, I've never seen a period that was more intense for you. And that's just saying something after my time in banking. And I think in the period, it was clear to me that the fog would lift, going with our analogy, that there was the industry would recover and we'd be in a very good spot. We had the makings of being in a very good spot. And so that always sort of guided me, even when we were going through it. And it sort of helped me keep going, Frank, because, it's pretty crazy, but you're juggling all these things at once. But that was a big part of it, I think, that allowed me to sort of focus on it. The other thing I would say, being able to quickly make decisions and understand how you make that. I knew the business. I had been at the company, although I was not as deep in the operations as I wasn't making as many decisions as I wasn't once I became CFO. I sort of had worked in various things around the company. So I sort of knew various projects, and I was chief strategy officer as well. And so I think the key was when you make decisions in crisis, you have incomplete information. So one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of executives, and this includes CFOs, I think some days, is that it can be harder for CFOs because some CFOs are somewhat risk averse. They go, if I cut this, I may save costs. Like, which is maybe I'm going to cut too deep, or I'm going to make it, should I exit that business? I don't have incomplete information. And I think one of the responsibilities of the CFO is to help corral people to make decisions. I remember with some of the decisions we made in that period, in retrospect, it seems like we made some good decisions. At the time, it's not always clear that decisions will work out, right? And so if that decision said no, it worked out, you would say, oh my God, those were terrible decisions, right? But at that time, you're making decisions on incomplete information. And one of the keys in a period of crisis, I believe, is like, you've got to put a rigid process in place to get through. Like, if we backstop where we have to get to, we have to make decisions by this point. Let's backstop and just say, we're going to make the best decision we can by 2 weeks from today, 3 weeks from today. What do we need to do that? And really bring the team along with you. And I think that was probably the big thing for us in that period, which is some decisions you always regret. You're never going to get things perfect, but you can't let, perfection be get in the way of, good or really good decisions. And I think that was a big part of it. And we made decisions in difficult period where we often had incomplete information, and you also overlay with the carriers. Remember, this is also, in addition to our own business, the real uncertainty we had was actually a macro dynamic, the industry dynamic. So getting insight into that dynamic, we could talk to our customers, but they weren't sure what was going on. And so what guided us was, information that we had pieced together from our own knowledge and our industry advisors, and obviously talking to our customers, but it was by no means like a 90% case. So we had to, so the other thing I would say is, as you think through forcing decisions, also think through your different paths. Like if it takes longer, shorter, we had, 2 or 3 different scenarios we worked on. And that I think also is helpful. So this is the course of all, because okay, we think we're going this way, we think we're going this way, coming out of this, we think we're going this way. So those are probably a couple of the things I would highlight.
Did you have any more near-term capital or cash flow constraints? Or were you more thinking, right, we need our EBITDA to go positive and be at 5%, 10% by a certain point in future?
So when your EBITDA is negative, you always worry about cash flow. In my book, and we had a business. We were in a business that we actually exited. One of the businesses we exited was we were in the healthcare insurance business. And the dynamics of that business were, from a cash flow perspective, challenging because you got long-term cash collections on selling healthcare policies, Medicare policies in the U.S., but you actually had negative outflows in the first year. So it was a complicated business. And the thing about our business today is it's back to our roots. It's a very nice cash generator business. It clearly converts. I think one of the things is, given the history we had in that health business, we not only had EBITDA negative, in some quarters, EBITDA would be negative, but cash flow would be far worse when we were in peak quarters for health. So that just further complicated the business. So one of the things we did do is, in addition to strategically saying, hey, where do we think we can win? Where do we think we talk to customers and help to go, as opposed to being an inch deep and a mile wide, let's go deeper in this vertical. Let's make sure we understand building value. We also tried to simplify where we could. So I think especially with financial information, there's so much information available. As we went through this, we really tried to say, hey, what are the key things we want? Of course, we would look at lots of things behind the scenes in the finance team, but what are the key things we can get people focused on? And I think that was a big part of it as well. And then if I go to, you said your question, what did I think about with the earnings call? Our first earnings call, so I do look back at it every once in a while. And I think the key is in those calls for CFOs is credibility, right? That is the number one thing, particularly coming out of this, out of all the changes we made. I had been at the company. I knew some of the investors from my time covering investor relations, and that was certainly helpful. But I was very mindful of investors. It's about credibility. In the smaller the company you are, the more credibility matters. And so one of the things I mentioned before we started, that I spent a lot of time with investors in the past, month or so. And one of the comments I made to them is, I said, we say what we were going to do, and we actually have done it every quarter since the summer of 23. And, there's obviously, you don't control everything. There's things that go one way or the other. But in general, the parameters we set out, we actually have met or exceeded them. And, it's one thing to say that for a year. It's nothing to say it for 2 years, and to say it now 2.5 years. And I think we're actually a far better spot as a company strategically and industry wise now than we were 2.5 years ago. I feel like we're in a good spot, but that credibility is really important. So we put out, the reason it really matters along the way is you certainly get some investors, they'll come back and investors, they take their notes and they go, what did you say last call? And they look here and they compare very rigidly. They analyze lots of things, but I think the key is, do they trust you? Or do they trust you? You're going to be good stewards of building value for shareholders. And a lot of the assessments they make come down to that. And one of the ways they assess that is, what do you say you're going to do and do you actually deliver on it? And we tend not, I think the other thing I would say in these situations is neither our CEO and myself are sort of into hyperbole. We tend to be known for being pretty straight shooters. And I think that also can be helpful. I think not all CFOs have the benefit I have as CEO. We tend to think very similarly on this. Some CEOs, I think of this in my time in banking, they are founders and they have large personalities. And so when you think about as a CFO, it's even more important in those situations that you are providing that credibility on the financials to investors.
So you mentioned your background into CFO. There are plenty of CFOs out there who have gone down the kind of Big Four path, audit path, etc. We've spoken about this before. You come from the IB path, and increasingly there are CFOs coming from banking strategy areas. What would you recommend to up and coming financial professionals, college students, etc., who are looking to have a career to end up being a CFO such as yourself?
CFO has a multitude of different responsibilities and attributes to be successful. So there's not just one model. There's a lot of paths to the CFO. The historic path was Big Four count, become them through company, maybe private company, help take the company public. That was very common. I know some of my CFO clients and 20 years of been banking, they would have that profile. I think what increasingly is becoming irrelevant in the finance world is how you think strategically about financial information. How do you help assess and analyze information? When I took responsibility for FP&A, prior to being CFO, I emphasized, we had some folks who were very good at running processes and doing reporting. I'm like, that's all interesting. I want less time in preparing reports and more time in the AI analysis. That is really the thing that I think is the driver. And so particularly as a public company, the CFO has to be able to think strategically. And I'd say increasingly the model I would say is, the CFO CEO partnership is critical. Like how are you, that, I think it varies in every company based on the personalities, but in our case, I would say that partnership is critical to how you're building value. And so I'd say for folks coming into it, you could come through, the audit path from accounting. You come through the professional services path in banking or consulting. I think there's lots of paths. And I think all those professional service starting points, there's benefits. If I look at our team and across the G&A functions, we have a lot of folks who come from professional services. And I think that can be very beneficial because you get to see a lot and you get professionally trained. So I think whether any of those could be passed, but I'd say once you're into an organization, once you leave the professional service world, come into an organization, what is the way to get exposure to other parts of the organization? I think that's a key part of it. The other thing I would say to young folks who are trying into it is, one of the challenges I often see, and this speaks to even when I was in banking, is you find folks who are like brilliant in doing like crazy spreadsheets or crazy analysis, but they were so narrow they couldn't step back and put some perspective on it. And so I think one of the key things for folks coming into this is not only be able to like do the numbers. That's like to me table stakes. Can you communicate the numbers? Can you write? Can you influence orally? Can you understand how to listen to people, frame issues, and bring it back to them to help them make a decision? I think that would be key. And I think that is not often the case. So people really have to push themselves to try those different areas. The other thing I'd say with CFO is, what comes under the CFO can vary a lot by companies. And so it's becoming more and more under the CFO. And so, I in addition to the finance function, I have sort of what we call business enablement, all the prior G&A functions. So I have legal, I have people ops, I have security and IT as well. And when I think about all of those, I think it's a lot of it is how do you help all of those different disciplines come together to help the business be successful in a long-term way. And so, and it sounds simple, but I think a lot of that does come down to when you come into these roles from whether it's whatever professional service background, otherwise you come into the companies, how do you come in with a mindset like, hey, my job in the G&A function is to actually help understand the business and help them be successful. And it sounds simple, but I've observed at various times in my career that the G&A function always would say, hey, I'm here. There was this tension. I'm like, yeah, there's some tension. I get it, but like if you educate each other on what you're trying to do and align, you'll get a lot more successful. So, and I think client service experience, whether it's accounting, consulting, banking, you learn a little bit of that sort of experience of working with clients that can be beneficial.
In the history of the company, you've had quite a few acquisitions. Can you talk to us about the M&A process there and what you're looking for?
So we did two small acquisitions, one that helped us bring us into the health space in 2020 and another into the P&C agency space in 2021. We ultimately decided to exit those business pretty shortly after our strategic changes in the summer of 2023. The strategy was, let's be in every possible insurance market: health insurance, life insurance, P&C insurance. And I remember talking to our founder at the time shortly after John, I said, you realize there is the only word in common across those three spaces is the word insurance. There's no company that does all three of those in the U.S. market. And even in the U.S. market, maybe if there's a company that does two of those, they run them as almost separate businesses, right? So we had this vision of doing all of the above and also trying to do first and third-party distribution, meaning we'd help carriers and third-party agents because we also were building on our own agency business as well. So lots of things. So we did two acquisitions that helped bring us there in the health space. We bought a small health insurance agent, a small P&C agency. We ultimately, and the change made in the summer of 23, we did those in 20 and 21. We exited those businesses pretty shortly thereafter, the summer of 23. And I think one of the things on health I would say was interesting is the learning was we got into a space because we got excited by what we saw out there, but we also, because there were a lot of public companies in the health space in the US that had very strong getting a lot of with the darlings of Wall Street. And we had this vision we could bring health and P&C together and cross-sell. It actually didn't work. So the lessons for us were, focus on really where, when you think about M&A, and I know this as an M&A banker, focus on not just financial engineering, but focus on really where you're building value. Does it align with your corporate strategy? And if your corporate strategy, I would say the acquisitions we did aligned with the corporate strategy because we had this vision of doing the everything. And I would argue that the strategy today is much more grounded in how we're building value. And I think as we look at M&A now, we're spending time looking at now, it's very focused on the corporate strategy. We have how do we help our P&C carriers and agents be successful? How do we help them grow in a way? And if we frame it in that context, and does it meet our financial returns? I feel very encouraged by what the opportunities are in M&A. But it's interesting, sometimes M&A, the health example is a good example. It does not go as well. And I remember an investor I met with fall of 23. I had a long lunch meeting, very prominent investor, and just became a long meeting, so I said, well, since he had a lot of money, I said, I'll stay here as long as you'll talk. It was interesting. He said at the very end, walking, and he says, what's interesting is you got into the health business in 20 and, you got a lot of fanfare around doing it, and you exited entirely in 23. And he goes, it's very rare in my experience to see a management team get into something with a lot of focus, a lot of attention, and then, exit, 3 years later and say, this is not working. We have to reassess. And I never really thought about it to that point, but he put it really, says, to me, that actually is a management team that I want to work with, that because I can trust that you will not be so wedded to a decision. You may have facts change. And in that case, the regulatory environment changed significantly. So that was one major factor that changed that we didn't anticipate or perhaps couldn't have anticipated. But I think part of M&A is also how do you change the circumstances on the ground as you learn more information. And you can't be so wedded to decisions that you're like, oh my God, we got to go here. You have to say, okay, back circumstances change, reassess, learn from how you do it. What does that mean for the next one? But that's a key part of it. So I think that was one lesson I think I probably took from M&A. It was a little bit different from a guy who did lots of M&A as a banker. When you actually try to do it in this context, sometimes the hardest thing is to say it's not working. How do we reassess? And not dragging it on for a long time and distracting the company further. And I would argue if we did the normal path, the investor coming back to this lunch in the fall of 23 said most of companies would say at least 5 years in a space. So if we had spent 5 years, imagine the distraction would have been having this period where we're trying to do all that we've done. I would say quite clearly there's no way we could have accomplished what we have with the auto insurance recovery if we had been distracted by having multiple things going.
That's great. The old sunk cost fallacy. Everyone's gets caught by it.
Yeah, it is. It happens. It gets. And I remember at the time, people became very emotionally charged, and they go, Joseph, like you helped do the acquisition. It was like your first child was the analogy because of the first acquisition I did. It's like I said, it's not. It's a little different. We have a little different role. It's not my first child. It was our first acquisition, And if it isn't working, it isn't working, reassess. But it is, that can be hard. So it was a good learning.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. And going back to what we said at the beginning about the P&C market, and I'm sure the insurance market more broadly, or moving from, or pushing the market to move from offline to online. Can you tell us more about that and the state of the offline business as it is today? Perhaps being a bit behind other sectors of the market moving digital.
So the great thing about insurance is if there's any market in the US, let me step back. The insurance, the other thing I'd say when I joined EverQuote, I thought it was a sign from above. In addition to being 2.5 miles from my house, and I love the founder, I had a little bit of family background in insurance. So I knew a little bit about the space. And so one of the fascinating things about insurance is in the property and casualty space, it's a space that has always been slower to change, right? And it's characterized in the US by a handful of large public companies, but also many mutual companies. And so the mutual companies can have a longer time horizon. That's the one benefit of being a mutual company. They think about, 100 years, 150 years they've been around, but they also sometimes don't adapt as quickly to change. And so one of the things that's happened in the insurance space and, in the US versus say travel, right? I'll give as a comparison, right? Travel, you can go to Kayak and you can see, you want to go from here to London, you can look at all the flights, you can book your hotels, you get what's called fully priced exit. All the details are there. That doesn't exist in the US insurance market, at least for the broad swath carriers. Why? Because today there's not this price transparency in the US, meaning carriers don't publish their rates broadly. One of the reasons for that is historically is that they've invested so much in their brand that actually looked at London, where you've seen this dynamic where the carriers have, as they went into digital, they actually gave full transparency in pricing, and all the investments they made in brand sort of went away in the UK market. More influence shifted to companies like ourselves in that market. I think the US carriers saw that, and they're very mindful of it's been slower. So you have a dynamic where the innovation happens slower. Second is they're protective of their brand. But the other dynamic I'd say is within insurance is it is a more complicated product than travel. Like, so the average consumer, if you're trying to shop for auto insurance, it's probably, 30 or 40 minutes by the time you get you take out your declaration page, put it all in, get connected to an agent or a carrier. It can take some time. And as a result, the consumer has also not been as ready as well. Fast forward, what we have today is if you look at digital advertising versus total advertising, it's sort of just one benchmark of digital penetration. Look at travel, broader financial service, they're 60+%. Insurance is like a third, depending which study you look at. And so long ways to go. And that's actually the exciting part when I look at it, because the US market for insurance is so complex, and then you have really 50 individual markets. And so you think about a marketplace. What is an internet marketplace? It helps to bring together, providers of a service or product with consumers who are trying to find that product. That matching concept is even more complicated. In addition to the price transparency, is that if you or I want to buy a ticket from Boston to London, hey, BA will sell it to any one of us. But with insurance, the rate is based upon your particular profile. What's your driving history? Do you have 2 cars, 1 car, first time driver? All those things factor in. So it makes the matching process that much more complicated. In some ways, that's actually the perfect opportunity for us. It's a massive market. There's this inefficiency in the market of information. So data and technology replaces that. And if you do that well, it allows you to really build a competitive moat that over time becomes a really powerful business and a very, very large vertical. And that's what we're set up to do. And that's the exciting part.
It's really exciting. So are you seeing future growth, not just due to your own strategic efforts, but actually the market expansion on top of it?
Yeah, we are. Yeah. So, one of the great, we have this idea, it's funny, I was just talking with the investors. I said, we have the secular tailwind of insurance online being very low. Another big benefit for us is we've had these significant rate increases. So in the US, we've had, depending on the state and the carrier, it's somewhere between 30 and 40% rate increases in the past 3 to 4 years. And when you think about what it means in an industry like insurance, industry is the P&C carriers are like quasi-regulated utilities in some respect in terms of how they go through rates. There are differences from classic utilities, but there's similarities in that they pay 10 to 15% of premiums go towards sales and marketing generally, and they try to have a certain profit margin. So when you think about secular tailwind of insurance online, second, you also have this dynamic of large rate increases flows through, and so the bucket gets larger for customer acquisition, and that benefits as well. And then you have this other backdrop, which is in the insurance industry, you have this dynamic, what they call soft market cycles. So hard market is when carriers don't want to acquire consumers. Coming out of COVID being the prime example of, they didn't have rate adequacies. They don't want to grow. Typically, when you go through a period of a hard market, you come out and you get rate adequacy, and now the carriers are quite healthy and they have stability in underwriting costs. So you put that dynamic together, which is they want to grow. In soft markets, they tend to be 4 to 5 year market cycles, and we're early in that evolution. And what it's categorized by is carriers trying to, they usually compete to win other customers, take share from the other guy. And that's a great place for us to be because they use digital channels. And then you take the other side, the consumer. When you see rates up at that levels, in the US, auto insurance is a mandated product in almost every state. And given just general economic, belt tightening, it's a top 5 expense for the average family. So you put that dynamic together, you have the supply demand dynamic that shapes up quite nicely. So we're excited as we look into 26 and beyond.
So looking forward, what does the future hold for you in terms of your strategy and growth plans?
So we're very excited by the future. So we spent a lot of time talking about. We just set a goal for us with investors publicly of sort of path to $1 billion in revenues. And so we said we'll be $1 billion in revenues in 2 to 3 years. And so if we in the high 600s this year, that means we'll grow. If it takes 3 years, it'll be mid-teens growth top line. If it takes 2 years, it'll be in the low 20%. If we do that at that scale, and we've also talked about expanding EBITDA margins on a path to get averaging 20% growth on top line, 20% EBITDA margins. If you think about that in the context of public companies, that's a top quintile and top decile performer. And we think that's the type of potential for this business. So that is really exciting because you get this very large market opportunity behind us, and we have all the dynamics I just described. The other nice thing for us is we think about the path to $1 billion as M&A certainly could be options for us as we try to go, but we see a very good line of sight to do that all organically, speaking to where the industry's at. And that's a pretty exciting time. And so what we're spending a lot of time thinking about, in addition to the top line growth, is how are we leveraging AI to build the business, right? So for us, AI has transformed business in many ways. And in some ways, though, although AI is a new topic from a lot of companies, in many ways, it's the next generation of what we did when we started as a business, where it's all use data and tech to acquire consumers online. If you're talking to one of our founders, he'd say, we literally knew nothing about insurance. We literally knew nothing. One guy goes, yeah, I couldn't even get auto insurance for my car. So I think what we've seen over time is that as technologies evolve, we figured out how do we take advantage of that. So with us, AI has become this here where a great example is we help carriers. So carriers, when you think about carriers trying to grow their business through digital channels, we run basically an auction in our business for most of our carriers. So the majority of our revenue comes from carriers bidding in our market to acquire consumers on a real-time basis. And they set up campaigns, and their own teams set up those parameters. We started this smart campaigns product about 3-4 years ago. And carrier, the comment we got from investors and industry folks is, carriers will never let you do that because you'd have to turn over your disposition data to us. So more data to us, and carriers tend to keep that pretty sacrosanct, that data. Fast forward today, the majority of carriers are actually turning that data over to us. Why are they doing it? Because they're seeing that we get better performance in our AI-driven bidding engine than they do trying to have their teams do it. And that's really exciting. And I think that we came out this summer with version 3.0 of smart campaigns. Significant increase in performance. Carriers are seeing 10 to 20% increase from their own teams. That is exciting because not only does it mean that we're going to get a deeper relationship with carriers because they're almost outsourcing the function of digital acquisition, which is a key area for them to grow, but they're also going to be able to share the data with us. And as we think about those two things, we're able in this spot because we've built trust with carriers. When they say care, I think about the EverQuote's history, we're not trying to revolutionize the insurance. We're helping to evolve in the digital age. And the big difference there is we think about how do we help to meet the carriers where they are and help in different carriers or in different spots. And you start with carriers often like a lot of industries that have been around for a long time, they're resistant to change. So how do you win them over? We win one over, if we win another over, then we go back and educate. And that's been something we've done for years on lots of things within EverQuote. This is a great example of that. What's most exciting about this one is the enduring ability of it, because as you get the carriers turning over the disposition data to you, we have the majority of carriers now doing it with us. It means they're actually getting more of their budgets. Is typically how when they get more performance, they give us more budget. But that data is very valuable to us because it in turn helps us inform our traffic operations on the bidding side, so we can be more efficient in traffic acquisition. So that we talk about a flywheel of a marketplace. How do you more efficiently acquire traffic to then feed the distribution side? That's a huge advantage there as well. So that's a great example of AI. And that's one of many. Another one we have going that we spend a lot of time as a team as we're talking about. These are in the innovation side. So how do we think about using AI, conversational AI, to help connect our local? We have 6,000 local agents that work with us. We have a product right now we largely do through PSRs, in-house folks, or a lot of outsourced services. We do outsource vendors or provider. Instead of using outsourced vendors, how do we could do conversational AI? So we're in the early stages of testing that. We've done very well with it. And we think we'll see that roll out over time. They'll have two benefits. One is it certainly could reduce costs, but even the more exciting piece of it is today that's an offering that's used by our larger agents because it's a fairly pricey offering, but agents love it. Could you potentially reduce the price to widen the TAM for the use of that product because you can do it and deliver in a more cost-efficient way? So these are a few examples on the innovation side. And then the other part we have is, and there's lots going in that area. Traffic's another area we're spending time. But we think that whole dynamic is going to be really exciting to drive innovation with on the carrier facing side of our traffic operations. But then internally, we're looking at how do we drive efficiencies with AI. And a lot of companies, they get sort of nervous talking like, oh, we're gonna make this harder. And one of the things we've talked about AI is we've sort of set a culture as we're going to have we've sort of said we're going to have a cap on our headcount of a certain level. We're going to have, modest headcount growth between now and, a few years out. But the goal is how do we make the team more productive and efficient? How can we let them do higher value things? And that works really well when you have a team of very talented folks like we do, and analysts and engineers and product folks and in our G&A functions, finance, et cetera. As opposed to hiring a lot more people, we're going to say, hey, how do we make you more productive? And how do we use it? So we just kicked off, and I should say just 6 months ago, we started an effort on internal use of AI. We actually examined it across the entire company. We actually focused initially on the business enablement areas of G&A as sort of the first test cases for efficiency areas. And one of the reasons we've been doing it there is there's a lot of use case you can look to externally to say, hey, there's a lot of companies of, $750 million to $2 billion in revenues. What are best practices? So we've been sort of relying on some of those, and that's been exciting. And the other place we're doing it is in our engineering organization. So that's probably another area we're thinking. In there, we're seeing just, we're not, it's funny, I just at an investor conference, and the same theme came up that we're seeing, which is we're not reducing our engineers. Engineers are just as important as they were before. We don't have to hire as much as once did, because the engineers we have are making them, I talk about, making them sort of super engineers, super employees, right? You can just make them that much more productive. We have a term internally, we call our employees goats. There's a goat mascot and stuff, and it's kind of a fun part of the culture. But we talk about going from goats to super goats and making folks that much more powerful. And we have, of course, AI-driven characters that do all this. But it makes it really fun because for employees, you say, as opposed to having them worry about job loss and change, you go, listen, no, we need you. We just want you to be focused on more high-value things. How do we take that stuff that made, particularly on an analytics, all of it has work that's being done that could be automated. And so we're doing that. Engineers, same thing. And that mindset around AI it's a very, gets a different embrace from the company because the ideas for innovation are really not going to come from the executive team. This will be a breaking news, right? The executive team does not produce the innovation on these ideas. It comes from the people actually doing the work day to day. They say, could we do this? We did, a day of sort of a hackathon. We called it Goat Tank instead of Shark Tank, seeing with our analogy. A couple weeks ago on AI, and we had all these ideas come out across the company. And I think that's a really important part on AI, which is we think about, when I think about what I'm excited about, I'm really excited about the growth trajectory and how we're going to build value. I'm really excited about how AI is changing the business, but how the team is getting so excited about how we can leverage it to move faster. And that's pretty fun.
That's awesome. It's an exciting time, particularly for a company of your scale. So I guess on that exact note, if you were to go into an organization and had to build out finance and operations from scratch, so for our listeners who have to do it, and particularly in times of crisis that you've lived through, what would you be focusing on doing and in what order? And also, how would that be different now with AI to what you would have done 5 or 10 years ago without it? And who would you have hired and who would you have not maybe hired?
Yeah. So I'm going to say this with full disclosure. So I have never started a finance organization from scratch. I've had to take a very small one and make it bigger and more and drive more results. But I would say there's two things you start with, like I think, which is I think you need a really strong controller and a really strong, FP&A finance person. And the reason I say is one, you don't know what's happening in business financially today. You got a real problem. You got to know where you're making money. That you're properly managing. And I say strong control, managing the cash flows of the business, et cetera. The treasury function. And if you don't have a really strong finance person, you don't know where you're going. So if you don't have those two people know where you're at and know where you're going, you're going to be pretty lost. So I'd say those are the two key folks I would focus on. What's interesting in the small cap public company world, and this is true, I didn't appreciate this actually till I became CFO, is that a lot of the functions that come under the finance function, whether you're a small public company or a mid-sized public company, those same issues come up, whether it's whether it's an investor relations issue, whether it's a tax issue, whether it's some issue on technical accounting or internal audit. And so one of the things we have done is, I'd say, having those two key folks is to hire first, but how can you leverage outsourced providers to help you with a lot of these things? And again, never knew this as a banker. Would have been, if you're going from banking into public company role as CFO, and your size company when I joined, which is, 300-400 million in market cap. But this is true up to a couple billion, is you can outsource a lot of these functions. And what that means is, like investor relations, we have a firm that supports us on these things, and they help bring specific expertise that we don't have an in-house IR person. On tax, an area that, historically we weren't making money, but we had all these jurisdictions we had to comply with. How do you outsource? And the benefit of that, I'd say, is you can get two really good folks. You have to worry about building out the whole team. And you can get, what I would say, if you were trying to hire someone as a small company, you probably couldn't afford to hire that senior, the partner level equivalent. And that partner probably want to join you if you could afford them, because they say, well, the issues you need, there's not going to be enough to keep me occupied, right? But those issues, one or more of those issues come up. So I'd encourage someone coming into creating a function is like, get the two traffic cops. It's like, where you're at and know where you're going or trying to go, put those two together, and then surround them through, outsourced providers who can fill in key pieces, whether it's internal audit, SEC reporting, investor relations, et cetera. And I think that's really critical. And I benefit when I came to this job. My predecessor did a nice job of building some of that network around us, and I've continued to build upon it. But I think it is one of probably the nice things for a public company CFO that those things exist. It's knowing how to tap into them, because in some cases there's large firms that do it, but the big four do audits. And a lot of these functions that outsource around public companies our size, they're much smaller companies, right? And they often have and that's kind of what you want as a CFO. You want the partner level insight, because whatever the issue is, like it's a big issue for you. You want someone who has the reps, so to speak. And so build that network, plug into those CFO networks to get that group, whatever that local group is, to help you. But that's really, I'd say, a key thing if I was going it from scratch.
And in terms of your looking back in your experience of growing a team, what are you looking for in team members in terms of those who are the next superstar, the next GOAT, those who are going to promote, etc.? And what would you recommend to people who are looking for promotion? Should they be making sure they get the credit for everything they do, or should they hunker down and deliver the work? And how should they be acting?
That's a really good question. And I would say probably think this has evolved over time. And I think I thought probably very differently in banking about this. I'd say first and foremost in these roles is like, you want smart and motivated people saying the obvious, right? So you got to have people who have whatever the discipline is, accounting, tax, they have to show that discipline. But you also want that married with intellectual curiosity. You want people who are willing to say, why is it that way? Because if you don't have that, you could be really smart, but you're not able to think more broadly. If you think about, going back to the early point of our conversation, which is a lot of the role of the CFO now is to think across different ways. And if you're not intellectually curious, I love to learn a lot of random topics. It's one of the fun things of my job. I have to get smart on some esoteric niche tax issue. Great. Let's dig into it and learn that. And, and I just find that kind of fun. I think people have to have that. And I look for that in various ways when I interview. I look for, sometimes it has nothing to do with finance. I look at, I talk about what they did in school. If they only did one thing in school, they may not be well-rounded. They may have some perspective. So I think that's a really big piece of it. And I focus on that quite a bit. The second one I think about is sort of culture and fit with the team. I think you can find a lot of smart people who are actually curious, but there's only a subset of those who are going to work with your team. And there are times you bring in the disruptor personality. So but putting aside consciously doing that is, I think when you're building a finance team, even different than professional services, it's more important that a CFO's direct reports, how well they work together. And that's maybe seems kind of obvious, right? I would say as an investment banker, you tend to not think about that as much. Yeah, you think about culture, but the degree to which you worry about fit is less issue because people generally come from similar backgrounds, whether it's accounting, same thing, come from similar backgrounds, you have similar training. So you tend to think similarly. And so the range of cultural fit is less of a concern on day to day. You avoid the outlier personality, right? When you get into an organization where the experiences are different, someone's coming through accounting to my chief accounting officer, someone's coming through banking to be a head of FP&A, someone's coming through strategies, coming through consulting. Those are very different personalities in different industries. So the range of personalities is wider and how they work together. So I think a lot about that fit. I've been doing a lot of interviewing as I've been, so I talk about outsourcing the team when you're smaller. I've been insourcing some of the teams. I've been in a lot of that next level down interviewing. So it's a big top of mind for me. The third I look for is sort of how they like to define their role. So because we're a smaller company and not a larger company, the analogy, I look for flexibility, right? And so because particularly in G&A functions, the ability to flex to cover different needs of the company. And the way I define it this way, if someone really likes a clearly defined, box on the org chart, that person could be quite successful in a larger company because they will actually like a clearly defined role and they'll respect the boundaries, right? In my finance org, there's boundaries, but they're more dotted lines, right? And the box may not be so perfectly shaped. It may be a little, pushed out one side or the other because we had to get stuff done and you were willing to be flexible. So that really is a big thing for me. So those are the three things I look for and sort of hiring. The last thing I look for when you say promotion, right? So one of my big thing in promotion is how effective are you at communicating and influence? So you may join a company, hey, you were smart, you were intellectually curious, you fit well with the team, you were willing to take on new challenges, you were flexible, great, that all works. But you ultimately, to advance in my team, you have to be able to influence, and that is, can you communicate effectively? Both written, we love writing at EverQuote. Can you write and do it concisely? If it's longer, I don't even read it. And the second is, can you influence? And part of influencing is, it's even a more challenging thing to do in the context of a company where you have very different personalities. When you're working with someone from the technology organization, they may have different ways of being influenced than if someone who's in the analytics organization or business development organization. So can you do that effectively? And if you had those things and got here, and then you can do that. The last is, are they driving impact? Outsized impact, and if you're doing that, you're going to get promoted.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And going back to your point on flexibility, there's a reason why there's a G in G&A, right? It's
exactly
ability analyst. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the smaller the company, the more it's required, right? Like I think some of the folks who are in my team, part of their success is they're willing to flex. I think some of them would have challenges in larger companies. They'd feel they wouldn't want a clearly defined role. And some of their colleagues would bristle that they're, my God, they're trying to do something that's touching my work. And and so I think that is, you got to be mindful of the company you're in as well. But I think the G and G&A is certainly, you got to embrace it at times. And we did a new office move. Our chief accounting officer and our controller were leading the effort. So facilities came under them all of a sudden because it came under me. It's just part of it. You got to go with it. So
yeah, absolutely. And so just to touch on what you're talking about before of leveraging AI and turning your team into super engineers, etc. Any technology is deflationary, right? And so as people are leveraging this, and the headcount isn't necessarily dropping, but it could be flatlining while the company's growing. To what extent do you see at EverQuote or the broader market, retaining that in EBITDA or passing the cost saving on to the customer? How do you see that playing out in the market?
So I think it'll vary by industry and it'll vary by company. And I think for us, it will vary at where we are in the journey, right? So I think early days of these things, particularly on the innovation side, right? So if you think about efficiencies in our company, often what we'll do is we'll take those things and we'll invest in more technology. You may not be adding a lot of additional folks, but you may be adding a lot of technologies, right? So some of these enabling AI technologies, they're not inexpensive. These are, you add up, whether it's, you go through your various tech vendors, you add that up on a per head basis, even if it's, relatively flat growth, those numbers add up pretty quickly. So part of this is you are taking the savings from not adding more folks as you're getting more growth to invest in technology. So I think that will have some impact on the investment. It's not going to all go to the bottom line, right? Because you're going to invest a lot in technology. I think that's in people. I just had this conversation with investors. I said, don't get too excited because I'll show you the seven-figure spends coming through from our IT and engineering organizations. But I think that's first. I think then as you go beyond that, I think for us is how do we continue to think about how we can drive innovation for those carriers and agents to grow their business, their customers succeed. And I think some of that could be pricing. I gave you the example, maybe you're broadening out the TAM for an offering because you can deliver it more efficiently. I view that as a pricing benefit because you can expand the market opportunity. And that's true in a lot of areas of technology. You have a change that makes it you can make it easier to deliver and lower cost. I think we will do that. And I think it'll be a benefit. In some cases, we'll benefit as well our margin because we can just do things more efficiently, and the market dynamics around a given thing may say, hey, you're not widening the TAM, that you're creating greater value for that customer as you're getting a greater share of it. So I think it's going to be all of the above. I think it's just over a question of what timeline. I would say nearer term, less going to the bottom line from these changes. It's more that it's being reinvested, often not in more people, but in the technologies. But that's exciting. I mean, and some of these things when we're doing, the innovation versus the efficiency, we sort of group them into those two buckets. Sometimes there's things that overlap with both. But it's amazing. We did this sort of a goat tank, as I referred to it, before Thanksgiving here. And the ideas it was all done by the team. So directly, the operating teams pairing with the engineering teams, the product teams. We got these amazing ideas, right? And I looked, I was like, because they're going to drive real benefits, whether it's making us more efficient, getting something done. So some of the examples came to, we were supposed to have 8 files. I think we actually expanded it to 11 because we had so many submissions come in across the company and we had to cut off several of them. And some of them were actually taking existing ideas and they'd say, this is the example of where you could use AI to do exactly what we're doing, but we do it far more efficiently. And we're some days should say, oh, that seems obvious, but we weren't doing it. We wouldn't suggest it. And I remember one example, I was like, well, that is like such a obvious, brilliant idea that we of how to apply AI in a way that makes a lot of sense. And then there were other examples who were like completely different ways of delivering a service. It's also, so I think both are really exciting. And that's, it's one of the many things that keeps me excited about EverQuote. I think we got a really good market position. I think we got a team that's, I think really, top notch and playing to win. But you also have this dynamic around technology, the big shift, and being sort of in the middle of it is great. You can see it firsthand, and we benefit because we see it through our employees. We're fortunate in the case of AI, we have a chairman who's our co-founder. He's not the executive chairman, co-founder, but he was an MIT guy, teaches a class in AI at MIT, and he brings that. So it just, for me, at some point, he's been through lots of technology changes. If I say this around the company, people will I'm not sure I was alive then, and the .com, I remember that period. I remember the mobile era. Those changes often when I see those things, those periods of time that change, yes, a lot of ideas happened that really drove transformation. It often didn't happen in the timeline people thought. So I think about some of the companies today that are delivering services to consumers in the US, some of those same ideas actually existed 20 years ago, 5 years ago. They just it wasn't the right time, right? So I think one of the things I'm mindful of is there's lots of lessons of these periods. It tends to take longer for it to come through, and you overlay we're doing in the context of the insurance industry. But all of that coming together, it's a great spot to be. Because you see all these changes going, it's one more thing that keeps me, I'm intellectually curious, as I mentioned. I think it's a key thing. And I read so much about AI now, and for a guy who, I joke I can barely turn on my computer. I find it fascinating because there's just so much change happening, and you can just think about how to apply it in your company in this spot versus here, and each one's different, and that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very exciting time. I think you look at Zoom and all those companies that did well after the pandemic, but you got Skype and web conferencing in the 90s, and it's different decades. But But yeah, look, Joseph, it's a very exciting time for you. You at EverQuote got huge admiration for people that are pulling the offline markets into the online. And this has been great to speak to you. So thank you.
Well, Dan, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for let me spend some time with you.
Thank you, Joseph.